Happy to be here. I just hope that you'll be thinking the same at the end of this talk. I'm looking forward to your questions and comments at the end of the session. I always find those very useful and allow me many times to pick up some things either I forgot to mention or wanted to mention and didn't feel I had time. But let's begin. As the 2020 presidential election nears, U.S. Russian relations are arguably at the lowest in 40 years, with little real prospect of any quick improvement. To the contrary, things could get worse. This was not supposed to happen. Think of the hopes of the early 1990s that saw a democratic Russia only a generation away. We don't even have to look that far back. George W. looked in what is a widely, I think, misinterpreted or misunderstood comment into Putin's soul, which Colin Powell claimed was a potential game changer. And then there was the reset when the Obama administration came to office and correctly judged that the decline in bilateral relations had to be reversed or at least stayed, and that the new Russian president, Dmitry Medvedev, offered some hope. While there were successes over the last 40 years, last 30 years, New START and the Iranian nuclear deal being two of the big ones, both the Bush and Obama administrations left office with relations far worse than they had hoped or planned. Whatever hopes Moscow had for the Trump administration, sanctions remain in place, and the new U.S. strategic doctrine lists Russia as a leading threat. What happened? When asked a similar question some years ago, British Prime Minister Macmillan answered, events. We will look at some of those events, but first, I want to step back and establish some context by looking at the systemic problems that bedevil U.S.-Russian relations. What I might call the 7 deadly sins or realities of U.S.-Russian relations. First, there's the problem of asymmetries in U.S. and Russian power. Regardless of Moscow's and others' claims that the U.S. is in decline, the U.S. remains a global superpower, while Russia, despite some successes, some progress, is still trying to reestablish its claim to great power status. As Angela Stent in her book, Putin's World, has noted, Russia is still more a player than a power in most of the world. Consider recent increases, just increases, in the U.S. defense budget under the present administration exceed the entire Russian defense budget. And before the COVID outbreak, Russian GDP ranked along with right about the same level as Portugal, or put another way, well behind California's. This asymmetry, I'd argue, explains Moscow's emphasis on the UN Security Council and at times arms control, is that these are still two areas where it can sit at the table. This asymmetry also partly explains Moscow's adventures in the Middle East, a region that historically has been a test or symbol of great power status. The asymmetry also, however, puts the U.S. in a rather difficult position of having to play along or pretend Russian power is greater than it is. It also explains Russia's interest in asymmetrical, and I know we've got a lot of asymmetry here, but asymmetrical responses such as cyber warfare and active measures, as well as its search for what I like to call silver bullets, those magic things that allow them to, on the cheap or quickly, gather greater power or influence than normally they might be able to. Second, while we have successfully worked together, There are many instances where our interests simply don't align. Different continents, different histories, different geopolitical demands on both of us. Nor are we natural trading partners, all the more so with U.S. energy independence. Indeed, we are often competitors, a prime example being in the arms market. This, by the way, is one of the big differences, I would argue, between U.S. relations with Russia and U.S. relations with China, and that is the foundation of trade. And in terms of the Russians, we still have a qualitative and quantitative edge in many areas. More importantly, to Russia's frustration, until recently, Russia, has not been the focus of U.S. policy. Indeed, when he first visited Moscow in 2009, President Obama specifically addressed this issue, making the point that we want to work with you together to solve common problems, but we are going to go ahead and work on those whether you agree or not. A similar message was delivered by Joe Biden as vice president a couple of years later. I think this explains some of Putin's adventurism in places like Central Africa, Venezuela, and more recently Libya. It's meant as a reminder, along with other economic and political concerns, but it is also meant as a reminder to Washington that Moscow is still here and its interests and concerns have to be taken into concern. And even as Russian policy has become more competitive, some might even argue combative, and at times seemingly anti-US, just to be anti-US, the United States has remained a central focus of Moscow's, despite its tilt towards China. Even, I would argue, because of that tilt, the US relationship is important. In fact, I think I would go as far as to say, from early on, and maybe even still, if we could secure a condominium of power with the United States, he would be quite happy. In fact, I would argue that that was one of the things that when Medvedev was president, was the aim or goal of his European security plan. A third reality, I think, is the ideological struggle of the Cold War. Capitalism, democracy versus communism may be gone, but we now face one of liberal democracy versus statism, authoritarianism. To this struggle, Putin brings a transactional, zero-sum view of the world that harks back to the 19th century. The result is a widening, or has been a widening, values gap. Now, until recently, we could take some comfort that the model Russia represents to the world has little appeal. But it would not be the first time in history, and I'm talking really about the interwar years, or the years between World War I and II, that uncertainty, in this case, born of doubts about the European Union and NATO viability and the US role in the world, has increased the appeal of the great man and authoritarianism. In Europe, Poland and Hungary, and beyond, Philippines, Venezuela. Fourth, I would argue that Putin, indeed Moscow, does not really have a strategic vision. And I know in many cases, I probably am a minority here. But what I see here reminds me of the old New Yorker cartoon in which a Einstein-like scientist is at the blackboard, and at one end of the board, the left end, he has his mathematical problem. At the far right end of the board, he has a solution. And in the middle, it says, a miracle happened. This is largely due, this I think lack of a true strategic vision, is largely due to a personalized nature of the Russian system. It's hard for any power to frame a concept of its national interests and strategy when the line between state and personal power and wealth is blurred. It's all the more so in a system like Russia's, where institutions are weak, corruption a fact of life, and where its leader has tirelessly worked to centralize power in his own hands. The result in Russia is a policy that often seems contradictory and certainly hard to predict. Much harder, I would argue, than in the Soviet times. It can also seem reactive and subject to a seeming cognitive dissonance where ends and means do not align, let alone justify each other. Examples, I would argue, and we'll look at a little later, are Ukraine and meddling in U.S. elections. Now, this might bring, this lack of such a vision might bring us some cold comfort, but I would be quick to add that despite the lack of that vision, Putin has played his tactical hand very well. And again, one example would be Syria, and another, ironically, Ukraine, wherein the tactical, in a sense, I think has been far more effective and might even be disruptive and self-defeating in terms of a longer range strategic. Now, compounding this is my fifth point, is a tendency in both countries to oversell policy to garner support at home. This is especially true, I think, on the U.S. side, and was a point made many years back in the early 1960s by Roger Hilsman in his book, To Move a Nation. I'm not talking about domestication of Soviet policy, which we'll look at later. Rather, what I'm talking about here is the overselling and raising expectations that all but builds disillusionment and disappointment into the mix and makes it hard to maintain policy direction. Examples in U.S. history: World War I, make the world safe for democracy, war to end all wars, mission completed, Iraq with George W. Bush. For Russia, this can, and I think has, often surfaced, particularly in the last 10 years, in adventurism, in areas that in some cases would lie outside what you think would normally be Russian interests. Six, what I'd call the hubris of great powers. Russia and the United States are both guilty of exceptionalism. Or in the case of Russia, since the time of Stalin, the mantra has been that no issue should be resolved, no great issue in the world should be resolved without Russia at the table, at least its participation. United States, we see it certainly more recently, but a prime example is Madeleine Albright's claim that the U.S. is the essential nation. But it's more than just that. I think it's in addition, a tendency to fail to recognize that some things can't be fixed. Some problems can't be fixed. They can only be managed. I think this is especially true and has been for maybe most of our history, certainly in the 20th century, for the United States, in which we tend to emphasize the end game or the results over the process. And on that score, I would just add that, and that's a problem because basically diplomacy is not an end, it is a process. Put another way, man plans, God laughs. Both sides, Russia and the US, often seem to be involved and competing just to compete, not necessarily with each other, but just to be there. Finally, and perhaps the most troublesome of these seven realities, is that, and also in many cases the most recent, is that domestic concerns in both countries are increasingly driving foreign policy on both sides. Now, foreign policy always has a domestic component. It is to advance our economic, political, our economic interest, political influence, sure. And there's, in an American history, there's always been, or repeatedly been times in which foreign policy has, domestic and foreign policy have mixed. But I think this is a little different that we're living now. And that is, in the case of the US, the Russia hand in the 2016 election, still a problem despite the Mueller and Senate investigation, indeed because of them, and is an essential issue in the election and in our partisan politics. Whereas it was always an imperfect idea, but we still like to keep at least the myth, is that foreign policy began at the borders and was not a part of the US political scene. In the case of Russia, what we see is that in the face of economic stagnation and domestic unrest, Putin has increasingly turned to nationalism, even militarism, to deflect criticism and I would argue forestall real reform. Now, against this backdrop, bilateral relations would have been problematic in the best of circumstances. But circumstances, events, were not the best. In some ways, the international situation and responses on both sides only encouraged worst instincts and in many ways a return to old thinking. But before I go any further, I want to stress one thing, and that is that no single event that we'll be talking about was a breaking point. Rather, it was a cumulative process. Even before Putin entered the scene, the Russians had created a fairly well-known bill of indictment of unhappiness, with you, if you will, with the United States. A sense is, in their more extreme moments, they would refer to as betrayal. And this came out of the breakup of the Warsaw Pact and German unification, which they argued was a breaking of a promise that was made by the Reagan administration. The eventual, more recently, our retreat from the INF Treaty, our failure to recognize Russian support but Gulf, NATO expansion itself, an old problem, which I would argue was an old answer to a new situation. Yugoslavia's breakup and what became seen as the Russian humiliation. U.S. emphasis on economic development as key to Russian future, which popularly in Russia was seen as opening the door to what Karen DeWisha has called Russia's kleptocracy. U.S. acceptance of the events surrounding the storming of the parliament in '93 and the election of Putin in '96. And then finally, the '98 economic crisis. All of this created doubts, suspicions about the United States, and even more importantly, it underlined the credibility, I would argue, of the market system, economic reform, and even democracy. As president, Putin approached the job with this in mind, but also with a fiercely transactional quid pro quo mindset. One might almost say that his interpretation was the old-fashioned one. Was one interpretation of the golden rule was do unto others before they do unto you. He also carried baggage from his own past experience. We all have known and heard of the KGB angle. I think sometimes that can be a bit exaggerated, but nonetheless real. I think the important part of that was one made by Dmitry Trenin of the Carnegie Institute in Moscow several years ago, in which he said the real issue here with Putin is that he sees our talk of values, he sees our codes of conduct, proper conduct in the world, balance of interests, what have you, largely as a cover for what life really is. That because in many ways, his own formative years, he, like many others in his security services, come at the world from a basic belief that it's the underside that counts. This was once, I think, driven home to me by a report that I heard from one of the EU Russia summits, in which the plenary conference had been held. The Europeans laid out their differences and their positions. The Russians laid out theirs. There was considerable distance between the two. And then they went from plenary into a meeting with Putin and the EU president, in which Putin then proceeded to say, okay, how are we going to fix this? And they said, what do you mean? He said, well, come on, we can strike a deal here. Come on, let's be adults. We know we can find a way to do this. To which the president of the EU said, wait a minute, didn't you hear the plenary? We have a position. You know, I'm here to represent that. And Putin just said, come on, we can do better than that. We can do a deal. Indeed, every once in a while when I'm looking at Russia, or at least probably about once a year, I like to go back and watch The Godfather, the first one, especially the scene in which they're, all the heads of the mafia families are meeting and discussing how to divide up the pie. One thing I think in Putin's experience, though, in the KGB that had real influence was, we have to remember, he was in Dresden when the wall came down, and when indeed protest approached not only the German government, but the KGB headquarters itself in Dresden. It was an upsetting moment, and one in which he saw the challenge to stability, law and order, whatever. At the same time, as Cliff Gaddy and Fiona Hill point out in their bio of Putin, Mr. Putin, is that during that time in the 1980s, he was in Dresden and missing out on some of the real psychological even and cultural change, political cultural changes that were going on in Moscow with perestroika and glasnost. Finally, I would argue that he's always been rankled and came to office with this idea of the unipolar world, with the United States as really the first power, as the first and only real power. Opposing that with the idea of a multipolar world and rallying support elsewhere in the world. Still, when he came to power, Putin seemed ready to explore improved relations, though perhaps skeptical of how far they would go. Witness his response, for example, to 9/11. He was the first to call, and he was offered not only Russian help, but actually did help convince the Central Asians to side with the United States and help it, particularly in Afghanistan. But of course, as I said, is a transactional, tit for tat, quid pro quo kind of guy. He was expecting a certain price. A price that all too often the United States was not prepared to pay, in part because it was too high. Two examples of identifying the problem in Chechnya with the international threat, and the war in Chechnya is equivalent of what the United States was doing to fight counterterrorism, and arguing that the United States should recognize the limited sovereignty of what the Russians called the near abroad, the former members of the Warsaw Pact and Soviet Union. Or the United States was simply focusing elsewhere, the war on terrorism, nuclear proliferation, and missile proliferation. This led Putin to become increasingly suspicious of US policy. Though he had offered his own help and solutions in Iraq and the UN particularly, the United States basically ignored them and went ahead with their own plan. There was, at the same time, and as far as he was concerned, and his thank you he received for offering to help in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 was US withdrawal from the ABM treaty and the pursuit of missile defense. US sympathy for the Chechens, and as I said, US refusal to accept the limited sovereignty of the near abroad. And in one of the most striking moments in the early years, 2004, his reaction in 2004 to the terrorist seizure of the school in Beslan, in which the day after, he was talking about other powers clearly having the U.S. in mind, trying to take bits and steal bits off of Russia. At one point in this period, this earlier period, 2005, he told Ambassador Burns that the problem is with the United States is you don't listen. Similarly, at about the same time, a Russian diplomat in Moscow told us that the problem with the United States is that you come and say you want to indulge in consultations or you want to undertake consultations, but you don't. All you do is tell us what you're going to do. You don't consult. Now, I want to also add that these early years, of course, were precisely when Putin was trying to consolidate and expand his and the state power at home. We see the crackdown on the media, the taming of the oligarchs, and a redistribution of wealth to his own elite. This was conflated in many cases, I think, in his own mind, to see foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy particularly, increasingly through a domestic lens. Driving this home, or in their mind, in his mind, confirming or hardening this suspicion, were the Orange Revolutions, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004, and then the Rose Revolution in Georgia. Still, even then, he was prepared to cooperate when it served his means. Prime example is through several ups and downs from really about 2000 to 2010, they helped us maintain and allowed the Afghan supply lines to transit Russia, which was a big help to the war effort in Afghanistan. Now, when the big break, I think, in Putin's view of the U.S. occurred is debatable, somewhere by, I think, 2004, 2007, but I think it is safe to say that his 2000 speech in Munich signaled that Moscow was thinking the relations game. And subsequent events only solidified suspicions on both sides. In that speech, he made it clear that Russia was not about to be pushed around. It was not about to abide by U.S. dominance in the world, and that its interests, its concerns had to be taken into consideration, and that it could be a problem if they weren't. And as I said, subsequent events, I think, only hardened this view and solidified suspicions. And events on both sides, for that matter. And events came fast and furious. The Georgian War, the financial crisis of 2008-9, the 2011-12 Russian elections, the Arab Spring, and of course, Ukraine, which in turn deepened U.S. distrust, and finally, of course, the 2016 elections and the ongoing problems of the Russian meddling and interference in the U.S. political process. Again, no one of these events wasn't in itself pivotal, but taken as a whole, one after another, they created a perfect storm with missed signals and opportunities and wrong lessons learned to some extent on both sides. It was all the worst, I think, because of a lack of institutional challenges to actually manage crises. The Georgian War and the financial crisis in 2008 were important for them in and of themselves, but they set the stage for the Obama administration. The conventional wisdom on the Georgian War is that Moscow set a trap for President Saakashvili, and the West, U.S., failed to adequately respond, thus increasing Russian aggressive tendencies. A repeat, basically, of the classic Munich syndrome. Reality, I think, was more mixed, more complicated. The Russians had been waging a protracted pressure campaign, using a salami tactics against in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, the two breakaway regions of Georgia, But they had been fairly careful to avoid a casus belli, an outright challenge to the Georgian regime. However, the pressure did increase after the 2008 NATO summit in Bucharest, where the alliance, despite what Putin thought were assurances to the contrary, raised the possibility, not the promise, but the possibility of Georgian and Ukrainian membership in NATO. It was striking to see Putin when that had been announced and he was next up on the podium. He was literally shaking with, I presume, rage. Now, in the case of Georgia, the U.S. had repeatedly warned Saakashvili of the dangers and of U.S. inability to do much if the balloon went up with Russia. But we were largely, I think, unsuccessful. There was a certain tendency to see, I don't know if those of you who are a movie fan like me might remember the scene in the Magnificent Seven, in which Yul Brynner is trying to convince one of the seven that they're not going in there for the gold. They're only getting paid by these poor farmers. And his colleague says, "Oh, I understand. And Yul Brynner says, "Don't understand me quite so much." And this is, in a sense, what I think Saakashvili was reacting to when we were trying to warn him of the dangers and some of the limits on our ability to help. In any case, there were mixed signals, at least as far as Saakashvili was concerned. And I think he overplayed his hand. Georgian moves in early August of 2008 basically gave the Russians an excuse to whack him. And they needed to justify military action on their own. But problems quickly surfaced. Saakashvili, I think, surprised the Russians in that he was able to hold on to power even after they had invaded, and also the Russian military stumbled. Russians, I think, took 3 lessons from the Georgian War that were going to be important down the line. First, it's a long way from the U.S. and even Europe to the Caucasus, which limits Western options and ability to respond. Second, while you may be able to exploit this, your military is ill-equipped. Third, and this, by the way, led to military reforms that would serve them and creation of a military structure and tactics that would serve them far better 6 years later in Ukraine. Finally, I think the third lesson is, or the third thing that came out of that is Putin began to have some serious doubts about Medvedev, who had just become really president the same year. The financial crisis of 2008, of course, followed hot on the heels of the Georgian War. A striking amount of commentary in the Russian media on it, in part, I think, because to get the focus off of Georgia. It was a sense of that combined with a charm offensive in Europe. But also, I think that commentary reflected concern about Russian investments in the West. Russia weathered the crisis fairly well, employing some clever physical and monetary devices, but came away, I think, with 2 wrong lessons. The West is in economic decline, and the Russian economic model that had worked, which meant there was little need to reform or seek further integration with the West. This was a convenient, even self-serving argument in many ways, as many in Russia, including Medvedev and Putin, recognized the need for modernization and diversification of the Russian economy, but were not prepared to pay the political costs or run the political risks of doing so, of entering that reform process. Enter the Obama administration with calls for reset, which the Russians welcomed, but saw it as something that was rightfully due them and refused to take any responsibility themselves. Still, there were some early successes, most notably on Iran, Medvedev's backing away from supplying long-range anti-aircraft, and his preparedness to go along with the UN action, UN, eventually NATO, U.S. action in Libya, and of course the signing of the New START treaty in 2010. Obama and Medvedev also, I think, had some rapport. Unfortunately, this only increased, I think, Putin's doubts about Medvedev. We had pretty good evidence that he was unhappy with both Medvedev's admission that Iran was a potential missile threat to the world, which in some cases justified the U.S. missile defense, his backing off the anti-aircraft deal, and his support and his failure to oppose action against the Gaddafi regime. On top of that, the U.S. cabinet was, from Moscow's, Putin's perspective, hawkish, most notably with Hillary Clinton and Bob Gates. Finally, the Obama-Putin relationship was anything but good. It was really, I think, a mixture. This is one of those cases where I think the personal relationship does make a big difference. It was really a case of oil and water, almost basically from the outset, from their first meeting in 2009. In the midst of this, of course, came the Arab Spring. And again, Putin's take was considerably different than Washington's. Rather than an opportunity for the democratization of the Middle East, Russia saw it as a realization of its worst fears of U.S. Iraqi policy, destabilization of an entire region, and an invitation to terrorists, and for that matter, Iranian meddling. In this, they were joined by the Israelis, most Gulf Arabs, Saudis, Jordanians, and even the Turks. As the Arab Spring progressed, Moscow became more and more convinced that it was not a spontaneous phenomenon, but a U.S. effort to export color revolution and regime change with clear implications and dangers for Russia. It thus was not simply a foreign policy problem. It was a domestic problem. Gaddafi's death, by all accounts, graphically drove this home to Putin and may have been a deciding factor in his decision in 2011 to return to the presidency. It certainly contributed to Moscow's decision to back Assad in Syria. The events surrounding Putin's re-election, beginning with the Duma elections in late 2011, only confirmed his worst suspicions of the U.S., indeed of Hillary Clinton, that we were out to get them, and it reinforced the link or melding of foreign and domestic agendas. It became, in Putin's case, personal. The Russia Putin returned to, however, was different than his first two terms. Increasingly, his base was the conservative, culturally and political majority. The angry urbanites, though small in number, could take to the streets, and more importantly, while they could be controlled, were more importantly the very people Russia needed to move forward. Corruption was rampant. Elites had become harder to handle, with signs of open opposition, even within the walls of the Kremlin itself. Despite higher oil prices, predictions for growth remained low, and the economy was on the brink of recession, if not stagnation. Russia had missed the oil shale tight oil revolution, much like it had the military technical revolution in the late Brezhnev years, 1980s. The Caucasus remained a festering sore, even as the Sochi Olympics neared. Of note at this period, post 2011, were rumors of Putin's failing health. It was never clear if these were political or physical problems, but what I think we were seeing was an example of a fraying of the Russian social contract, and a search for some unifying idea to to bolster the regime's legitimacy. The hunt for an external enemy or threat was a natural fallback. And not surprisingly, we saw an increase in anti-US propaganda and policy, the expulsion of USAID, the passage of NGO and foreign agent legislation that made heightened the threat for both domestic and those supporting domestic opposition. Even the Snowden affair. Deeper arms control and advances were hung up on missile defense. On the domestic front, there was a similar crackdown and consolidation that quite frankly upset how many of us in the West saw or predicted Putin's staying power. In other words, he was seeing the same problems that we were, and we were talking about his hold on power being brittle or fragile, and he took steps to correct that, eliminating many, but in doing so, he eliminated many of the mainstays of the regime, the so-called clans that had organized and helped Yeltsin, but also was a base of his support, the oligarchs, even some of those from the Siloviki ranks that he had brought in when he came to power. And it consolidated his own personal hold on power and control, which also, however, made him responsible for power. Much harder to shift the buck. Also, there was a strong shift to the right on cultural issues with political significance, like the role of the church, the Orthodox Church, LGBT legislation, and general law and order. Something that not only had some appeal for his own base, but also had appeal elsewhere and was used internationally. Enter then Ukraine, and at the risk of overusing a cliche, another perfect storm. An example of foreign policy in the service of domestic priorities. If in fact you can separate those any longer, the foreign policy and domestic, it's really the only way, that conflation of the two is only the only way I can explain some of Putin's decisions. Granted, there were missteps on the Western side in terms of the EU's association agreement with Ukraine, not perhaps consulting or assuring the Russians. But I think the onus for the crisis still lies mainly with Moscow. And it's all too facile readiness to sacrifice the strategic for the tactical, the long-term interest for short-term domestic concerns. Moscow was concerned about the EU-Ukraine association agreement and President Yanukovych's westward drift as early as June 2013. The concern was that the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement would make it impossible for Ukraine to become a member of the Russia counter to the EU, Eurasian Union. And thus weaken that union and Russian efforts to establish a larger economic and political footprint in the old former Soviet Union. The problem here, though, in any case, beginning really in the spring, they began to develop what they would call or was called a comprehensive program, largely active measures to thwart this. The problem here is we're talking about an EU association agreement, not NATO membership, and about Yanukovych, hardly a sturdy oak. He was pretty slippery. And more than once he had made signed agreements, and then found a way to wiggle around them and do what he wanted to do. I'm still not convinced that it would have been impossible for him not to find a way out of both signing the EU agreement and going along with the Russian association as well. Also, the other puzzling thing is Putin held him in complete contempt and calculated and those around him, around Putin, calculated that Yanukovych was basically doing this for domestic reasons to stay in power. But in deciding finally to back him, they seemed not to see the problem that, well, if that was the case, why are we backing someone that might be on the way out? In any case, Yanukovych's waffling and the resulting Maidan demonstrations in Kiev, rekindled memories in Moscow of the Orange Revolution in 2004. U.S. and EU support for the demonstrators only confirmed or hardened those suspicions. Problem here is Russia seems to have forgotten what happened after the Orange Revolution came to power, and that is little change really in the Ukrainian body politic. The Russians, in any case, seems surprised, or also were surprised, by how fast the EU was getting its act together and moving forward with the association agreement. This added urgency at the end of 2013. A vote in the Crimean parliament in favoring union with Russia in December gave the Russian, or so I should say, opposed to the EU agreement and supporting Yanukovych, gave the Russians some hope, and hope that Yanukovych could stay on, or that they might be able to work some kind of possible plan B. And it seems clear that they began to lay the groundwork for that option, should it be needed, and ultimately did implement it with the so-called Green Men in Crimea. With the collapse of the Yanukovych regime and his departure, they moved to exercise that option, Crimea, and a similar one in eastern Ukraine. Early steps of the new Kiev government, like the declaring Ukrainian as the only official language, somewhat helped him in their effort. But I want to make a point very clearly here. This, in the eastern Ukraine and in Crimea, this was not a public separatist or a separatist rebellion. It was, certainly in the eastern provinces, engineered and led by Russia and supported by Russia from the beginning. Now, some would argue Moscow harbored some important gains, and that's when I go back to say that there were some tactical victories in Ukraine. Ukraine is not in NATO, and it's hard to see that it will be anytime soon. The potential to upset or upturn the new government, or at least exert leverage of it, they had also gained. But this was unrealized, or has been, and only partially. And the move did bolster public support for Putin and the regime. His popularity spiked to 80%. Perhaps that was the most important thing, and maybe the most important goal all along, my original point. But I would argue these were largely Pyrrhic victories. It meant that Russia and Ukraine were going to be at loggerheads. Also, sanctions instituted by the United States and the EU were going to be a fact of life, hurt, and only get worse. Throughout, I would argue they underestimated really the longer-term costs and the ability of the West to respond and maintain that response. I think they were feeling that this would pass much like the Georgian did, but of course it is not. And again, I would argue this is an example of confusing short with long-term goals. They, of course, compounded this error with the U.S. election in 2016. I'm not going to go into great detail because I really do want to get to some discussion. And I think that this is one that most of us are very familiar with. And I have not read the entire Senate report, unfortunately, but it's on order. But I want to just, in general, look at a few things of the 2016 election, because I think they're still relevant now. And the first one would be, why'd they do it? You know, why light that fuse? Why stick an eye, basically, stick a stick in our eye? First, I think it's because they could. Active measures in which their interference would largely fall on had been an arrow in the Soviet quiver really since the beginning of the regime. It was not always the most successful, and indeed I once heard a former resident, chief of a KGB post in Western Europe say that as a KGB operator or head of a KGB mission, if the only thing you could point to at the end of the year was the success of your active measures, most in the organization, the KGB, didn't think you were doing a great deal. Nonetheless, what we saw is that the cyber age brought a whole new dimension to the ability to do. It was no longer simply a matter of getting press plants. It was no longer a story of planting misinformation or disinformation in the press, of recruiting a journalist to put out your story. But this was able to, I would argue that the whole revolution of social media and the internet really added a new dimension and new dangers. The GRU, the Russian military, had been playing with the technology for several years. It had launched some attacks in the Baltics, it had done some during the Georgian War, and elsewhere in Europe. And in fact, even now, if you look at the pure number of incidents, those who have, in some of the centers, particularly in Europe, have pointed out that the United States is actually not the top target. You see them a lot more active on some of these things in places like Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. And I would also argue that we may never know really how effective they were in 2016. In other words, we will never really know, did their interference, their meddling, make a real difference in the election, the final count. But keep this also in mind. Active measures are most effective when they have an amenable, it's like a virus, an amenable host and landscape. U.S. divisions, questionable, dubious personalities, WikiLeaks prepared to cooperate, the list goes on. The United States was a good target. The other why, I think, and I mentioned it earlier, it was the personal. Putin, I think, wanted to embarrass Hillary Clinton. That's, in my mind, a chilling idea, because when it becomes that personal. Goals, I think, also probably changed or evolved over the course of the election as the Russians saw how things were progressing. Bear in mind that most of the reporting we had, and it's sketchy, I admit, at least in the public domain, they seemed surprised by Trump's win. They seemed and did not necessarily claim credit for it, but nonetheless, they did not need, because, and I think the important thing, they did not need that win actually to fulfill a basic goal. And that was, I think, discrediting the election process, raising doubts about the legitimacy of US elections, and playing and deepening divisions within US society. Okay, now what? Though I have been known to ruthlessly search for a silver lining, I'm not particularly optimistic, certainly in the short term, for US-Russian relations. Neither side is positioned to change its basic chance unless the other caves. It's a zero-sum game. Positions are, and a major reason for that is positions are too tied to domestic politics. Putin's popularity is declining, and not surprisingly, he has turned to both nationalism and even militarization and adventurism. And more worrisome in doing this, I would argue, he has tended to demonstrate a greater tolerance for risk. And I see it in things like the number of attacks on poisonings, attacks on Russians overseas. And it also may go to this question of the bounties on US soldiers in Afghanistan. Although that one I think is a little murkier because the evidence of precisely what was done is still, I think, incomplete. On the U.S. side, we see it as this is a major part of the last year, the political campaign of the election of 2020. We also see Congress playing an increased role in this, which is also going to make it harder to see both of those, to see shifts in our position. In part, just an aside on the congressional, and I'm not saying Congress should not have, of course, a role in foreign policy, but what I think we have to be careful about is that first, it means we have multiple voices in this, which makes it hard for our friends and foes to sort out the true policy and the message. Second, ever since the Gingrich Revolution of '94, Congress has been dealing with far smaller staffs. Still good, bright people up there, but they do not have, I think, the resources that they had back in the 70s, 80s, and even early 90s. Moreover, I think we have something of a lack of leadership, a lack of the type of individuals like Nunn and Lugar, who were able and prepared to reach across the aisle. Although there are, I think, some exceptions even there. I think the other problem is that it's too easy to fall back on old think and old ways, especially with Putin sounding off about new arms developments, abilities to challenge the United States in new military realms. And this, to me, raises even a larger question, a troubling one, and I sometimes wonder if which of course all of this has led the United States to elevate the Russian risk, along with China, but along with this. It almost leads, and it does lead me at times to wonder that if the US, and for that matter Russia, can function in a non-Cold War environment, in a non-threat environment, and go back to the warnings now etched in the memorial to the man of Eisenhower about the military-industrial complex, a complex, though different, but that exists on both sides. Prospects for arms control negotiations, a bedrock for relations, even in bad times in the past, are not good. Indeed, we have had a retreat on the U.S. side from arms control already approved, ABM, now INF, and the open skies. Also, I think there's no mechanism for alternative approaches or alternative means of communication. Traditionally, we have had a double track, a two-track, in which at the we could official, unofficial, we could have meetings with groups like the Dartmouth group, the Pugwash Conference on Arms Control, which still exists but have not been, I think, used. Part of this, under the Obama, we tried the vice presidential, Biden, Putin, and then avenues were explored but not really adopted. And a second track right now is very, very hard to see. I remember a story that Ambassador Teff told that when he was discussing this problem with the Russian official, and he said, what about a double track? And the Russian said, that'd be a really good idea. And he said, well, who might be on it? The Russian immediately said, well, not Hillary Clinton, but we could find. And Ambassador Teff said, yeah, but we could certainly find someone else, and suggested a few names. And then he said, so who would be on the Russia side? And the Russian said, well, of course, Putin. Well, that's not a second track. Fundamental reform on the Russia side is also all but, I think, is a distant hope. In fact, all but politically impossible, because it would mean hurting his base, and not so much his enormous popular base, but his elite base, those who are sharing in the spoils. And this, I think, was driven home by his decision to change the Constitution, allowing to stay in power until 2036. A new generation of Russians, I think, is a hope, but it's probably illusory. The new generation is a Putin generation, and voting patterns show that they have actually come out in support of Putin. Now, all of this support for Putin is, of course, fundamentally dependent on his ability to control the media and control the discussion domestically. What I'm saying is that I think Putinism, at least in the short run, could even survive Putin. But now we don't have to have, despite popular desire for change. But now I don't think we even have to have, we have to worry about surviving Putin, because the last election showed apathy and sensed that no real alternatives were possible. And the real message of this summer's vote on the Constitution and changes allowing Putin to remain in power sort of also gave an answer, if not, if imperfect, solution. We may see some solution to the eastern Ukraine. It's possible, but I don't think we're going to see anything. The Minsk process continues, but I don't think we're going to see any real problem, any likely withdrawal or solution to Crimea. Indeed, what I think we're probably going to have to adopt is some kind of legislation and some kind of approach similar to what we did with the Balkans from 1940s up to the fall of the Soviet Union. And I would argue that the situation in Belarus raises all sorts of new questions and potential hotspots. Election interference, of course, continues, is a fact and continues. It can't be ignored. And it too has become part of, as I mentioned, US domestic politics, which could limit even a new administration's options and maneuverability. All right. Yet I would still argue there are some signs that there may be some openings, at least on the Russia side. At that meeting that, rightfully, the president got so much flack for in Helsinki, Putin's position was, I found, as did others, interesting. He seemed to be saying in his speech, look, as far as Ukraine, it's a mission accomplished. Let's try and get this behind us. Now, we're not about to do that anytime soon, but I think it does show a recognition, even some that he has taken heat in his, when he has pulled back on some of his support for the separatists in eastern Ukraine from his own right, that he recognizes that they should find a way out. Also, Russia still needs the United States. Russia basically gave up on the EU. China is problematic at best, a lever, but not really a real action, especially in the longer term, because Russia and Putin does not want to see Russia become a Chinese junior partner. Putin, I'm sure, would like a return to a pre-Crimea war, but with the West accepting Crimea. He needs a big deal for both foreign and domestic reasons. Use, however, of nationalism, militarism, and for that matter, the constitutional change suggests he does not have a very good answer. But how do we begin to exploit some of this? How do we, this is where I would say it's back to the future. First, we have to remember where we were in 1981 when the Reagan administration came in, the evil empire, and loggerheads with the Soviets. First, I think it's going to have to be small steps, what could be confidence-building measures, if you will, and no grand promises. Again, this idea of creating or exaggerated expectations. This is true of whomever wins here in November. A good start would be a New Start renewal, and we see even hints in the Trump administration that this is on the table, and possibly beginning to advance discussions, open discussions on COVID-19 or pandemic in general, and climate change. Arctic could be another less threatening area in which we could have some dialogue. Second, we need to develop ties and contacts at the working level, both informal and formal, much as we did in the 1980s. It might not be a full two-track approach, but I think it would be a track and a half. Third, maybe more important, we need to develop a holistic approach. what do we want? What can we reasonably expect in exchange? And from that, I think we could then begin to develop some kind of strategic approach. In other words, the fourth thing we would need, again, a return to where we were in the 1980s. We would develop a working agenda of several items, much as we did in the 80s. And that agenda included strategic, regional, bilateral, with a heavy emphasis on economics, and institutional exchanges at formal, informal times. And to that, we could add possibly new topics like climate and health pandemic. This would be very, very tricky with sanctions still in place, and with the sanctions, the hand to control the sanctions being partially taken out of an administration's hands and now under congressional control. It would also be very difficult with a U.S. domestic climate, but I would argue it has been done before and at least should be explored, if not tried. The other thing I think in this, the strength of this kind of approach is that it tends to de-link each one of these nodes. They're joined, obviously, and you try and make progress across the board, but you're sometimes able to make progress in one or two while the others stay mired in differences or just stymied. Finally, I would argue, and this is for the United States, cyber, by the way, would be another one of those areas that I think, to begin to develop some kind of code of conduct. Finally, I would argue, though, that the key element will be a unity of voice, a return to when the United States more or less spoke with one voice. This would be both between the parties, but also within the administration, whichever administration emerges itself. Right now, the administration does point that they have been, spokesmen for the administration, Trump administration spoke that they have been tough on Russia, right. But the president taking a different line opens up divisions, and it opens up areas that are going to be explored by Moscow. We also have to return, I think, to and strengthen our multilateral approach, both with our allies in NATO, but also within institutions like the United Nations. Now, it'll probably be a long haul. We can't forget the policy of containment, which I do believe succeeded, took decades. It may be a generation, at least 20 years away from real change in Russia. And then you have to be careful what you wish for. For as Putin may have created a system that can only be really changed by revolution. But on this, I'd like to lead with just quickly a closing thought about where we are right now as we approach the election and the future. And many of you who have taken my course have heard this before. It's from Abraham Lincoln. From whence shall we expect the approach of danger? Shall some transatlantic military giant step the earth and crush us at a blow? Never. All the armies of Europe and Asia could not by force take a drink from the Ohio or make a track on the Blue Ridge in the trial of 1,000 years. No, if destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we will live forever or die by suicide. Thank you. I hope to hear your questions.
Yeah, Wayne, thanks a lot. That was a lot to take in, some great insights. We've got a bunch of questions that have come in. I think I'll give you an opportunity to probably dig deeper on a couple points. So the first one, it says, how do you differentiate between the good relationship between Trump and Putin and what you consider to be the poor relationship between the two countries? And I'll just add myself also, how much opportunity is there for singular personality, whether it be a president or secretary of state, to really change the relationship given, the history of the countries and the momentum of the policy? So if you can kind dig deeper on that whole aspect.
Well, first, I was trained as a historian, so I actually do tend to believe that history is moved by people, personalities in some cases, at some times, as well, of course, as larger trends and movements. But I think people count. The example to me is one of the best in our recent memory, or was what we saw in the 1980s at two levels in our relationships with Moscow, and that was the Reagan-Gorbachev and the Schultz-Shevardnadze relationships. These were real. They were personal. There was an element there of trust, not naivete, but and they made a difference. The Trump-Putin relationship, in a lot of ways, is a mystery to me. I think part of it, I really believe that Putin does see Donald Trump as an opportunity, as someone that he can manipulate. And I think Trump perhaps has an overweening pride, similarly, that he can always get the deal, manage to carry the day. Even though sometimes I'm not sure he really knows what the deal is or what he's going for. What I tried to lay out in the talk was the deeper problems that we have, in the systemic problems that we have with our relationships with Russia, and how, on top of that, the series of events really over the last 20, 30 years has created this present situation. As I said, I'm not real confident we're going to get out of this anytime soon, both because of the baggage both sides are carrying, also because of the systemic differences that aggravate these, but also more importantly, or more urgently, I think if we do get out of it, it's going to have to be some way that we can find, again, of getting around the link between domestic and foreign policy in both countries, but particularly, I think, in the U.S. And departisans, I don't know, how do you departinize? That's not a word, but I think you know what I mean.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so we've got a couple of questions on election interference. Got a long one here. This is with regard to Russian interference, the U.S. 2016 election. Doesn't Putin have a point that the U.S., primarily through NGOs, aided Democratic and anti-Putin forces in the run-up to his last election? Was Putin's interference, primarily using social media any more egregious than U.S. official support for democratic groups in Russia, albeit with a cover of NGOs? Couldn't it be argued that the U.S. influence on the Russian election was greater than Russia's interference in our 2016 election? And also append to that, a very short one, that someone says, do you really believe that Russia interfered in favor of Trump? So kind of take all that and do with it what you want.
Well, let me answer the first. This is why I said in the talk, the second question, I can do that one quickly, or quicker. As I said in the talk, we may never know exactly what their goal was. In other words, in as early as the spring of 2016, were they thinking, let's go with Trump? I tend to think not. My read, and this was one of the interesting things when the intelligence community came out with its first and some subsequent, they tended to harden their position, or took a little harder position than I may have on what the motives were. I think the original idea that the Russians were exploring was just to sow disinformation, disruption, confusion, exploit divisions within American society, the body politic, and at times that could mean that they could throw support with some of their hacking and others to Trump. At times they could even create inflame the right by doing some things with minority groups, LGBT. You know, they had a pretty rich palette that they could use to paint there. And I think that's why I said at the end of the day, whether Trump won or lost, they would have still gotten, I think, with their fundamental goal, or they would have achieved it to some degree. And that's why also my biggest concern, I'm not even sure that their interference really threw the election. The first question said maybe we did more in 2011 and 2012. I don't think so, by the way, that was the case, but it's a question to ask. And I do not equate yes, the United States has interfered in elections and in regime change. Probably the most famous one, the one that everybody tends to go back, was the Mossadegh overthrow in Iran, or the Allende. Okay, yes, we did it. In the case, though, of comparing the 2011, 2012 with the 2016 and what we were doing, I don't think there's really it's a valid comparison. It is one thing to try and influence a foreign election. We've done it. Other governments do it. Our allies do it. With us, and the Russians have done that as well. That is through things like support even to NGOs, coming out and hosting conferences, making giving briefings, making that in a sense has, while nobody likes it if you're the target of it. It's a fact of life. It's another thing to interfere and undermine. And I think that's the difference here that we saw between what we were doing. The NGOs were legal. The NGOs, we were also not supporting per se candidates. We were supporting democratic institutions and structures and procedures. And we were attempting to see that there was a fair and open election. I don't think that's what the Russians were doing in 2016.
Okay, great. And this is somewhat related. Would you agree with the following statement? The United States is afraid to counter Russian cyber attacks because our society is more vulnerable to cyber warfare than theirs. If not, what else could explain why we aren't doing anything to punish Putin for their meddling?
Well, one of the problems, actually we are. The sanctions, we've got a raft of sanctions in order. Now, the problem with sanctions is that they are not immediately effective, but we do know that they have impact. And those sanctions, by the way, are from the Georgian war, the Ukrainian, and the interference in the election. The other thing is that we cannot, it's hard to, admittedly, for us to suss out how much on the economy have the sanctions impacted, or falling oil prices and other things. It's, so we have seen it, but we have seen the decline in the economy. I do think it's a good point, though, that in some ways we are more vulnerable in that we are a more open society, and I'll just leave it at that, a more open society. I do think we have already responded. You might recall that in late 2018, there was that, never got some press play, but it's never clear exactly what we did, but I think it could be called a shot over the bow of the Russians about cyber. One of our problems, I think, with the cyber, and I think we are going to have to develop strategies and ways to fire warning shots or to develop deterrence. And I think we can. But one of the things that we have to do there is draw a divide between cyber warfare in the sense of trying to shut down nuclear sites, blow up, disrupt dams, take the grid down or whatever, and election interfering. Those are two, I think, different, related, but two different types of plans. It's interesting that right now the Russians, as far as we know, and seems to be from the Senate report and others, that seems to be and the latest CIA briefings up on the Hill, at least what we see in the press, is that the Russians are not this time hacking and dumping at least not at this point, as they did with the WikiLeaks and the emails. They seem to be going more towards what the other part of their campaign in 2016, and that is spreading disinformation, creating false fronts, sowing division, doing things to question the legitimacy of the process.
Okay, here's a kind of a general specific, also specific. I'm going to combine these. So what is Putin's end game, his ultimate objective? What does he envision for his legacy, new USSR? And then also someone very specific, does Putin think he's immortal and that he does not need to mentor someone to come behind him? Did the Medvedev experience sour him on preparing someone to lead in his absence?
Yeah, good point. Interestingly, by the way, Medvedev is still around. He's no longer prime minister, but he is deputy of the National Security Council. It's some think, and I think I'm probably one of them, that it's nice to keep him there just in case you need him. Also, you never want to whack your elite and your contemporaries too much, because that does build resistance and it builds resentment. So it's an idea that it's the old idea, let's keep your, what is it, keep your enemies, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. I mean, or better, or as LBJ used to say, and I know, and we tried this out on Putin once, that it's better to have them pissing in the tent pissing out, and outside the tent pissing in. So there is that. Does he consider himself immortal? No, but I think in some cases he himself is stymied as to what to do. Giving up power is simply, I think, a little too dangerous. Also, he has been so effective at consolidating and centralizing that there really is no alternative to him right now. The elite knows this, which is, I think, one reason why the core elite of the Kremlin know this, is why they're not real fast to move. That's not to say that if things were to continue to go downhill on the economy, if indeed the elite's own hold on power and wealth and whatever began to be threatened, they might not be thinking of taking stronger measures themselves. I think it's important to keep in mind that in Russian history, the most common form of power change, power shift, regime change, has been a palace coup. It hasn't been elections, not even revolution. So I think there's that part of it. Well, again, David, could you give me the first question again? I just.
Let's see. It was let me find it real second. Well, what's his end game? What's his ultimate objective?
I don't want to be too flip here, but I've always loved the scene in Key Largo when Edward G. Robinson says to Bogart, he says, "You don't know what I want," and Bogart says, "Yeah, I know what you want." And Robinson says, "What?" And Bogart says, "More." And Robinson, the gangster, kind of smiled and said, "Yeah, more." I think that's, of course, I'm being a little flip there. His legacy, sure, to be the great restorer of the Russian nation, to be the gatherer of Russian people, to be the person who history sees as making Russia great again. But I think on the day-to-day level, it is far more a matter of balancing competing interests and survival. And it's not an easy job. It's interesting that some have pointed that Putin is relatively slow to make decisions. He's not particularly impetuous, especially when it concerns his hold on power and his inner circles. He is, I think, cautious. I've often thought, though, that a lot of the posturing, and in some cases, whether it's the bare shirt and wrestling with tigers, or the threats or hints of a stronger, more powerful Russian policy, whatever, is a little bit whistling past the graveyard. He's got to know that he has real substantial problems. He's got to know that this cannot go on forever, although I would also say we should not be too quick to say, well, it's going to end soon. It can go on considerably longer. Think about the Ottoman Empire in Europe in the 19th century. For that matter, think of Russia in the 19th, early 20th century. The sick men staggered on for some time.
Okay, Wayne, you know, we've reached the 4:30 times point, but, you know, we still have a lot of very interesting questions. I guess I'll ask you, Wayne, are you willing to just kind of continue on and see how many of these
we can give it a few more. Yeah, we can give it a few. Yeah, let's go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so this one has to do with how will Putin react to the prospect of Lukashenko's possible demise? We know Putin bears no particular love for the Belarusian leader, but we also know how scared he is of color revolutions on his border. How will he play this? And also, how much, a separate question, how much of a threat are these particular uprisings to Putin?
Well, I think, first on that second question, his threat perception, he seems to take them very, very real. In fact, if anything, you could argue there's an overreaction in many cases. I've sometimes argued with colleagues that, you know, like in 2011, he didn't have to rig, or 2012 presidential, he didn't have to have that rigged. He probably could have won anyway. He might not have gotten the high numbers, but he still probably could have come in with what in the United States at 60-some% would have been a landslide. But as some of my colleagues that I have great respect for pointed out, well, you aren't Putin. You don't know what the milieu and what his threat perceptions are. And also you don't understand how I think Putin himself and those around him want to be real careful. It would be hard to have a real election in Russia with Putin still in power because nobody wants to tell him the bad news. So his regional reps and whatever are going to be sure he gets the necessary numbers. Nonetheless, he does again I would say take this seriously. There were stories, and fairly I think well documented, that for instance on the Gaddafi, he watched the tape of Gaddafi's killing several times and apparently took it very much to heart. He also, I think, has to know that that in these situations it becomes highly unpredictable, and so you don't really know what's going to happen. So yeah, I think he takes them seriously. If anything, he might be overreactive, but you know that's sort of his call, and I think it's understandable. Better safe than sorry. The Lukashenko one is a fascinating one. A couple of working groups that I belong to, we've been looking at it for some time. Last week we just had some exchanges with some people on the ground and elsewhere that have been watching it. The question for Lukashenko right now is probably going to be, will the security services stick? This was a problem in the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. The security services stayed home. They said, the demonstrators, we're not going to take to the streets. They took off their uniforms, sat home, and watched TV. Lukashenko has always been able to defend on them. Now the question is, where are they in the equation? The next part of that question is, how are the Russians? We know that the security services probably have very close ties with the Russian security services. I wouldn't say that they are, speak as one, but they are there. And so the lines of communication are probably open. Some of the things that Putin has said have been, I think, very carefully scaled, if you will. He has said that they're going to pay particular attention to the situation, but he's emphasized the foreign element of that in the situation and not really the domestic, which opens the question of how far they're going to go to support Lukashenko per se. The problem I think they were going to have is can they find a acceptable alternative? And this really, I think, has been the problem with Lukashenko's strength in some cases vis-a-vis Moscow, has been they haven't yet. Who is the other person that they feel can preserve their interests and relations. They have tried, and I think would still be interested possibly in resurrecting the idea of the union state. And of course, the failure to do that, I think, was one of the reasons why they moved ahead with the constitutional changes to give Putin the opportunity to run again. But I think that could still be on the table. My guess is that they themselves, the Russian, Putin, haven't really decided themselves what they're going to do. I don't think, in a sense, they've been forced to that tipping point. I don't know if they even have to, in this situation, institute the idea of the green men, whatever that they did in Ukraine, because again, the links between the two services, the security and the Belarusian and Russian services.
Okay, thanks. Here's a kind of a general one. What is your outlook on the relationship between, well, Russia-US and China-US? I suppose this kind of harkens back when you're talking about, a unipolar world or bipolar, or maybe now we have a tripolar world in terms of heavyweights playing around in the world. So I don't know if that's something you can tackle in a short time or not.
Just very quickly. The Chinese have been very happy to exploit or use the differences in U.S. Russian relations. Absolutely. The Russians, and they have used it to solidify, to improve and deepen relations with Russia, particularly on economic front, but also to blunt Russian concerns about against Chinese maneuvering in Central Asia, Eastern Europe, Africa itself. Heck, they were in Venezuela before the Russians were. And I think the Russians have some concern about what's going to happen in South Asia, not only just with Afghanistan, but also in the Indian Chinese. But I think the problems with U.S.-Russian relations have enabled the Chinese to kind of finesse that with the Russians. It has certainly helped them form, I wouldn't say an alliance, but a coalition on issues like cybersecurity, UN policy, like that. And so I think in some cases, the Chinese have come out winners, have profited from that relationship. The Russians, I do not believe, have managed particularly to profit from the differences in the U.S.-China. In part because they don't have the economic SWOT or weight to make a difference there, and this is largely, I think, still an economic differences. And also, I think the Chinese recognize that they've tended to compartmentalize that, and I think also the Chinese have some faith that this can possibly blow over. Now, the difference, though, one thing I would point out is the Xi-Putin relationship this personal relationship has actually prospered. They refer to it as the ice cream diplomacy. They give each other, send each other ice cream every once in a while. But that one, I think, has been, and I think the part of that is that Xi has actually, I don't say he's using Putin's playbook, but he has taken steps reminiscent of what Putin has done in consolidating power, eliminating dissent and other voices. And so I think that there might be something of a natural sympathy there.
Okay, thanks. Here's one. Well, a couple of them I'm going to combine here. But so we have an election coming up, obviously. And how do you see the future relationship with Russia differing depending on the outcome of the election? Also, do you see anyone in the Senate that can act in a bipartisan, or multiple people that could act in a bipartisan way where you would have a more singular voice coming from Congress?
Well, I think a lot of it's going to depend, especially on that last point, how the election goes. If this turns out to be 1932, in which you see a Democratic sweep, both houses, yeah, you're going to see a more unitary voice, I would argue. But I don't think you'll see a completely vanishing on a variety of domestic and foreign, of differences. But yeah, the Democrats will be in a better position, I think, to advance their agenda. Similarly, if Biden gets a mandate, he would have that too. But as I pointed out, because of where relations are now, and because of the link between the domestic and the foreign policy, any president in January 2021 is going to be somewhat limited in his ability to maneuver and advance any kind of agenda with Moscow, should he want to. And that, I think, will be interesting also to see as the campaign proceeds, where particularly Biden and the Democrats are coming out on the Russia question. We haven't seen that much at this point. I will say this. As vice president, Biden did have dealings with Putin. And on at least one occasion, this is where I differ with Bob Gates in his book, in which he said that every foreign policy issue Joe Biden addressed he came up with the wrong answer. On this one, on at least one occasion, it was quite clear that Putin was taking on board with Biden's message, even to the degree that later we saw him picking up some phrases and all but quoting Biden and where the relationship could or should go. And the basic message Biden is that the world's problems are big enough, we have to confront them together, and the tent is big enough that it can contain us all. And I think that, my guess will probably be that if it's a new Biden administration, will probably be the direction. That said, I don't think that a lot of the other elements of even the current policy is going to change. It might be, though, as I think the question implied, a more unitary on the executive side, in that we do not have this seeming disconnect many times between what the administration, in the terms of Defense Department, State Department, whatever, is saying, and what the White House is saying.
Okay, let's just a couple more, I think.
Good.
Yeah.
My voice is going.
Yeah, you mentioned baby steps to possible improving relationships, and this is a question having to do with that we're in a coronavirus crisis. Is there something that the U.S. could offer Russia as a gift or an aid to help the fight? Although as you read, Russia, I think, is already saying they have a vaccine, and so I don't know. Is there any cooperative opportunities there, I guess?
I really don't know in some ways, but I would think there would be. Early on, Putin made a big deal of sending us assistance, masks and respirators and whatever. That was, it was theater. I mean, but whatever. But sometimes theater is very useful. One way I think theater could be used here for us, and it might also even be a matter of calling their bluff and saying, look, you guys have the vaccine. They are notoriously non-transparent on much of their stuff. But let's see if we can work together. Let's work together. Show us what you got, we'll show you what we got. Okay, yeah, we know there's proprietary problems with U.S. businesses and their whatever, but I think there's ways we can work around. The other thing that interested me not too long ago is that the former head of DARPA, the Defense Department, the guys that sort of invented the internet and other things, stealth planes and everything else. But the former head said that, this might be a Sputnik moment, in the sense that we saw that with the Russian launch of Sputnik, this explosion in the U.S. of programs, science, and technology. But this time, it could be one in which we say, let's try, is there places we can explore to do this together? It strikes me as worth a shot. As far as low-hanging fruit, a new administration, if it's not already done by this administration, which conceivably it could be, although the signs are not that positive. But the low-hanging fruit, of course, would be to New Start. And that would be one that basically a new Biden administration could do right out of the box.
Okay, and this is going to be the final one, and you can weigh in as much as you want. There's a whole basket of questions. I applaud the audience for not doing outright conspiracy theories, but there are some questions about, why do Russians hate Hillary? Did they blame her for the death of Gaddafi? Do the Russians have something on Trump? And then finally, what was a little more meaty, I guess, what was Senator Biden's achievement or role in Ukraine, and what is Putin's opinion of Senator Biden? So you can feel free to take as much or as little of those to tackle as you want.
First, I think on Putin Biden, as I said, they have met. I think Putin probably has taken his measure. I think he probably sees him as a serious person, and that's always a nice phrase in Russia. And that's about as far as I can go. I really don't have any, tremendous insights on that. I do agree with what we've been hearing from the intelligence community, from the DNI's office, that it seems very likely, probable, that they would prefer to see the present administration remain in office. It would just be, they know what they got. They know what I think they feel they know what they can do with it. And the a new Biden administration raises a lot of uncertainties and questions. This, by the way, yes, it does have something to say about what they think of Trump, but it's also not real outside the box as far as even in the Soviet period. The Russians tended to prefer a little more stability than constantly changing chairs and people. Why do they hate Hillary? I think that is personal. I think that Putin very much saw that she was trying to undermine his return to the presidency. They also felt that she was very quick to blame the Russians and put responsibility for the Russians on problems from, for instance, in Syria, and was frankly a little more more hawkish and potentially confrontational, certainly than Obama was. Again, I got to think: did that sort of get it, or was there something else in there? I should have taken some notes.
I think that's it. I mean, yeah, that pretty much covers. I mean, the only, if you again, do the Russians have something on Trump? You said that they would prefer him, but again, if you want to leave that alone.
I think one of it's an open. I have to say it's an open question. Being on the outside now, I don't know, but I haven't gotten a strong feeling from, what I'm talking to friends that are still privy to a lot of stuff I'm not anymore, that it's an open question. One thing I do want to state, though, and this is, I think, important from out of the Senate report, the whole Steele dossier issue. I think one of the things that we got to be careful here on the sensationalism and voyeuristic qualities of that Steele dossier and the reports. We've all known it, Golden Rain and all that stuff. What we probably, I think most likely, and we may not have been quick enough to see that, is that was probably a GRU or FSB disinformation campaign. I would not be surprised that a lot of that was planted for Steele to pick up and package it and send it forward. Other things. Oh, by the way, I think one other thing that could be something of a game changer in all of this, and again, I don't know if we're ever going to get to the bottom of it, and that was because again, once again, it's been politicized, but we just don't know, at least those of us on the outside, the whole question of the Russian bounties on American soldiers in Afghanistan. That opens up a whole different kettle of worms. If, and I want to put if very strongly, that is true, to me that'd be very concerning, because in my mind, that crosses a line. And it's different even than when we see the poisoning of, for instance, Russian intelligent types in England. That's still within the family, and that it's reprehensible perhaps, but I can understand it and explain it and even believe it better than I can this other. So again, that could then be, word proven and whatever, that could be something of a game changer.
Okay, that's fantastic. And for all the audience that stayed with us for so long, we finally got to the juicy part. The rest of it was very informative and important. And we thank you, Wayne. And